Okay, so whenever a president makes a big military move, you expect a reaction from Congress, right? But what if that reaction is, well, just an act? Today, we're diving into a really provocative argument about the US Iran confrontation. It's one that asks if the loudest critics in Washington are actually being hypocritical. And it's a story that weaves together legal power, decades of failure, and a very, very difficult moral choice. And this quote right here, this is the core idea we're going to unpack. The argument is that when lawmakers express all this moral outrage but don't actually follow it up with legislation, it's not real oversight. It's just a performance. It points to this huge disconnect between what some in Congress are saying and the legal reality they not only operate in, but, as we're about to see, a reality they helped build themselves. So let's start with this charge of political theater. The main argument from the sources we're looking at is that this huge wave of condemnation from some members of Congress, it isn't just a simple policy disagreement. No, the claim is that their outrage is hollow, that it rings false when you hold it up against the very laws they're supposed to be upholding. And here's the real rub. How can you protest a president for using powers that you, as Congress, not only created but have consistently refused to change? This is the central conflict, the real friction point the sources want us to look at. This massive gap between the power Congress willingly gives away and the accountability it then tries to demand from the sidelines. Okay, so to really understand this accusation of hypocrisy, we've got to look at the actual law they wrote. There's one very specific law that's at the heart of this entire debate, one that was supposed to create a careful balance of power between the White House and Capitol Hill. So at the center of the War Powers Act is this 60-day window. Now, that wasn't some kind of accident. It was a very deliberate compromise. The whole idea was to give the president the flexibility to act fast in a crisis, but to make sure Congress had the ultimate authority to say, okay, that's enough. But, and this is the part that changes everything, Congress actually has to do something to pull that plug. If they do nothing, their silence is basically seen as consent, which is exactly why so many people argue the act is a pretty weak check on a president's power. And this chart just lays out that central tension perfectly. Look, on one side, you've got these really strong, fiery condemnations from lawmakers. But on the other side, the sources just point back to the legal reality, a framework they argue makes these actions totally permissible, a framework that Congress has had every opportunity to change but hasn't. But this whole legal debate didn't just pop up out of nowhere. The sources frame this as the end of a much longer story, a story of about 50 years of failed policy that, in their view, basically ran all the other options into the ground and set the stage for this very moment. The argument here is that after almost half a century of trying literally everything else, from diplomacy and sanctions to the big JCPOA nuclear deal, the whole context for making a decision changed. Because according to this analysis, the fundamental behavior of the Iranian regime just never changed. And you can see that cycle play out right here on this timeline. It's a clear pattern. There's an attempt at engagement or some kind of pressure, then what the sources call defiance from the regime, and then boom, we're right back to a crisis. Every single major step, from a diplomatic deal like the JCPOA to maximum pressure sanctions, eventually led right back to the same point of conflict. So why? Why did all those policies fail? Well, the sources argue it's because the regime's core priorities were just never about opening up or becoming more moderate. They claim that ideological survival and making the ruling elite rich always came before the well-being of the Iranian people. Now, beyond all the legal and strategic talk, the sources we're looking at make a really powerful moral case. They argue that what the regime was doing to its own people created a situation that just couldn't be ignored anymore, what they call an unavoidable moral outcry. And this is where things get really, really sobering. It's about the human cost that, according to these sources, became a major factor in all this. They use this incredibly stark, almost biblical phrase, prophetic blood guilt. Now, that's language designed to convey something more than just violence. It's meant to describe a deep, systemic moral rot that, in their view, demanded some kind of answer. 36,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's the high-end estimate from NGOs for the number of protesters killed by the regime during the massacres of 2025 and 2026. It's an absolutely staggering figure, and it's meant to show the unbelievable scale of the violence we're talking about here. $7,000. According to these sources, this was a so-called body fee that some families were actually forced to pay the regime just to get the remains of their executed children back.
It's cited as an example of a kind of cruelty that is just beyond political repression. So the sources lay out this whole machinery of repression that goes way beyond just silencing dissent. They describe it as a full-on assault on human dignity itself. From shutting down the internet to hide what they were doing, to specifically targeting the most vulnerable people, it's all presented as a very calculated, systemic pattern of violence.
Okay, so how do you tie all of this together? You've got the law, this long history of failure, and this incredibly heavy moral argument. Well, the sources present a pretty challenging picture that connects Congress's authority with strategic necessity and ultimately moral duty.
So here's how the sources basically sum up the entire case. To the accusation that the action was illegal, the justification they offer is, hey, it was within the legal framework that Congress itself built. To the claim that other options were on the table, the response is, yeah, and 50 years of those options failed. And finally, to the charge that this was all just a reckless choice, the argument points to the regime's moral blood guilt, which made doing nothing seem like the most reckless choice of all.
And all of this leaves us with one final, really uncomfortable question that's so much bigger than just this one event. It really makes you think about the nature of power and responsibility itself. If Congress writes the rules that grant a president all this authority, does its responsibility just end there? Or does it also have to share in the accountability for how that power is actually used?